Welcome again to the Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale, and this is our 7th lecture. In this lecture, what I want to do is focus on time series analysis of the wolf and moose population abundances. There are going to end up basically being 3 different ways that we can analyze this time series of wolf and moose abundances. And the first method of analysis we've already done. That's this historical analysis. We did that just a couple of lectures ago. That method is rather qualitative, but it also is quite a broad and big picture and reveals a number of pretty important and robust insights. And so now what I want to do in this lecture is focus on what's referred to as would be statistical time series analysis. This can get pretty detailed in some of the quantitative methods and that sort of a thing. We're going to kind of sidestep a lot of those details and still kind of focus on what the overall message is and the basic lessons we can learn from it. But we'll get a little bit involved with some of the technical details. And then just so you can see ahead where we're headed to next, the third method by which we can analyze this time series is to look at really detailed mechanisms of predation. Look at things like the kill rate and the functional response and the numerical response and predation rates. Those are technical terms that we'll discuss what they mean in a subsequent lecture. But just basically each pass that we take is going to be a little bit more detailed than the pass before. Now, detailed doesn't mean better. Detailed is just different, and it's going to give us different kinds of insights. And so with that in mind, we'll move forward. Now, statistical time series analysis often has to do with a technique known as regression. Now, if you're familiar with regression, everything that I'm going to describe in this lecture will be very straightforward. If you've never heard of a regression before or are unfamiliar with it, just a few moments, just about 1 or 2 minutes of quick overview, and you'll know everything you need to know at least to kind of understand what we're talking about here. And so first of all, regression comes in different kinds. The first kind of regression is called simple regression. And simple regression is what you do when you're trying to relate 2 different variables. And on this graph, the 2 different variables are just x and y. And simple regression is basically about finding the line that best fits that data. And that line can be described by an equation. And that equation is described right here. You can see the x and the y are in the equation, and they're also illustrated on the graph. And so now what we can do is make one little change. Notice how the x and y axis, I put some equations there, and I said x is equal to wolves, and y is equal to moose. And okay, well that's fine. Then that allows us to make a simple change in the equation itself. Where it used to say y, it can now say moose, and where it used to say x, it can now say wolves. Okay? This line can be described entirely by 2 features. One of those features is the slope. That's just how tilted that line is. If the line is perfectly horizontal, then we say the slope is 0. As the line gets steeper and steeper, then the slope gets bigger and bigger, either negative slope or positive slope. This sort of situation that we have here with the declining trend, that's a negative slope. The other property that's required to describe this line is the intercept. And the intercept is just where it is that line crosses the y-axis or the vertical axis, if you like. Those 2 properties are reflected by these 2 betas, these Greek letters. Beta 0 is a number, is equal to the slope, and beta 0 is equal to the intercept, and then beta 1 is another number, and that's equal to the slope. Okay? The other thing that we need to know is that when we fit a line to data, the best fitting line may fit the data extremely well, as is the case on the right-hand side of this image. All of the data points line up exactly on the regression line. Or in other cases, as in the left-hand example of this image, the data may fit the line very poorly. The line itself is not really a very good indication of where the dot on that graph is going to end up being. And then the case in the middle is something in between. We need a way to quantify that, whether it's a good fit or not such a good fit. And there's a quantity referred to as r squared. R squared is a number that lies between 0 and 1. 0 corresponds with the situation where there's a very poor fit. 1 corresponds with a situation where there's a perfect fit. And then numbers in between represent some case that would be in between. Now there's a more precise way of understanding what the r squared is, and that's indicated by the text on this slide that we're looking at now. It's a pretty important sentence, and so we'll read it, and it's worth digesting and thinking about, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. R squared is the proportion of variance in the y data that can be explained by the x data and the regression line. So another way to think of this, and here we can focus on this middle graph right here, is a good one to be thinking about. And what we want to understand is that along the x-axis, there's variation in the values of x. There's some values of x that are low and some values of x that are high, and so on. But there's also value in the y data. Some of the y data is low and some of the y data is high, so there's variation there as well. This line indicates the fact that some of the variation in the x is useful for explaining some of the variation in the y, and this r squared value tells you how much that is the case. And so it's a pretty important interpretation on r squared, and we're going to use it quite a bit here. Okay, that's all that we need to know about regression to understand the things that I'm going to describe to you now. Now what I want to do is shift back to the ecology. Whenever we do statistics, we have to do a bit of translation, if you will, between the language of statistics and, in our case, the language of ecology. That transition process is extremely important and sometimes very difficult, very subtle, very nuanced. And so we're going to go through that translation process right now. And so on the ecology side of things, we have to have a question. And the question is a pretty simple one, and that's this: what causes a moose population to fluctuate? And then the possible answers include things like, well, maybe predation or forage or climate. Or we can say something a little bit more precisely. Maybe it is fluctuations in predation from one year to the next that causes the moose population to fluctuate. Or maybe it's fluctuations in forage from one year to the next that causes the moose population to fluctuate. You can see that the way in which I'm using those words rather carefully, it's going to help kind of bridge over back to that language of statistics. Okay? So we've got a great ecological question. What causes a moose population to fluctuate? And we know what the potential answers are. And we've got a method to kind of bridge it back over to the statistics of things, and we'll complete that bridge in just a minute. But first of all, I just want to point out a few things. The question is not only well suited to doing some statistics, this question is one of the greatest questions in all of ecology. We can say it a different way, and the other way to say it is, how do predator populations affect prey? Do they affect it a lot or not so much? And when we say they affect predators, affect a prey population a lot or not so much, it has to be in relation to something else. Well, in relation to what? Well, in relationship to forage or climate or something like this. It's one of the great questions in ecology. That question has been with us since the very first days of ecology, and it'll be with us basically forever. And so Isle Royale is figured in kind of importantly in understanding this question. Not only is it an important question for the science of ecology, but it's also important for management, because this question has important implications for what's known as predator control. Predator control is this idea of killing predators on the landscape and killing them for a reason. Killing them for the reason that we think, well, if we kill them, it'll have some benefit to the prey population. In this case, we can be thinking about moose. And why would we be interested in this? Well, maybe it's because we want to hunt moose, and the fewer wolves that there are, then there'll be more moose, and if there's more moose for us to hunt. So it's a very important question in management. And the basic idea would be this: is that if wolves don't have much influence on moose in the first place, there'd be pretty little value in killing them because it isn't going to make much difference. However, if wolves have a big impact on the prey population, then it becomes an open question as to whether predator control is a good idea or not. And so we can use regression to answer this question that's at the top of the slide, and it'll have these implications for both science and management. Okay, I had mentioned already simple regression, which is this idea of relating one variable to another, relating x to y, relating wolves to moose. This is sort of a simple thing. What we need to do is something referred to as multiple regression. And in multiple regression, we want to know how several variables relate to some other variable. And those variables have specific names, and they're best appreciated by looking at the equation. The variable on the left-hand side is referred to as the response variable. It's the thing we're trying to understand. And in this case, it's the moose growth rate. And the moose growth rate is like a percentage. It's the percentage of increase or decrease in the moose population from one year to the next. That's the response variable. It's the thing we're trying to predict. If we were to make a graph of it, it would be what's on the y or vertical axis. All this business on the right-hand side of the equation, there are a couple of things here. One thing that is here are the predictor variables, wolf abundance, something about balsam fir or forage, and then something about climate. These are the predictor variables. These are the three things that we want to know. How do they affect moose growth rate? And so let's imagine to look at all of this in a graphical sense requires 4 dimensions because there are 4 things that are involved. The growth rate, the wolf abundance, fur, and climate. It's hard to have a 4-dimensional graph. In fact, you can't have a visual graph that does just that. But you can do 3 dimensions, and that can get us quite a bit of the way. And so, if you have a graph in 3 dimensions, the thing that we're trying to predict is the moose growth rate. That's on the vertical axis. And then 2 of the things that we're interested in knowing how they affect moose growth can be expressed on 2 of the other axes. We can call the one the x1 axis, and we can call the other the x2 axis. And I've just used wolf predation and forage as a way of illustrating those ideas. And so now you can see this would be multiple regression where there are just 2 predictor values. When you make such a graph, well, then you don't have a line anymore. You have a surface or a plane, and that's indicated by that grid. And then you can see in here a cloud of data points that represent, well, each one of these data points. You can just, let me change things here for just a minute. You can see this data point right here. So that data point corresponds to a particular value of predation, a particular value of forage, and then a particular value of moose growth rate. And so we can make those relationships all at once. And so, what we're going to have, I already mentioned what wolf and fur and climate refer to. Again, fur is shorthand for balsam fir, and that, of course, is an important food item for moose. And so what I want to point out now are these different beta values. Beta 1, 2, and 3. These basically describe how changes in each one of the predictors, whether it be wolves or fur or climate, how changes in any one of those predictors will translate into a change in the moose growth rate. They are, in a technical sense, the slopes. They are the steepness of those lines that we saw in some of the previous graphs. But now, because the graph becomes so complicated and a little bit abstract because it's in 4 dimensions, we're just going to rely on just the numerical interpretation. A big value for beta, whether it's a big positive value or a big negative value, that's going to indicate a large effect. Okay, so that's basically how it works. We need to go through a few more things. I already mentioned that what's on the right-hand side, what's on the left-hand side of the graph is the moose growth rate. That's the percentage of growth in the moose population increasing or decreasing. I mentioned that balsam fir refers to forage. In particular, it's the amount of growth that we observed in the tree ring data for balsam fir. If you remember from a couple lectures ago, we talked about how it is that we use tree ring data from balsam fir trees as an indicator for how much forage was present. And then for wolves, I don't have any graphics about the wolves. Wolves is very simply, it's just wolf abundance. And it's the basic idea, if there are more wolves, well, there must be more impact of wolves on the moose population. And so that's the best way to kind of indicate the intensity of wolf predation. The last thing to talk about is climate over here on the right-hand side. And by climate, what we're really interested in is how one year's climate differs from the next year's climate. Another way to say it, a technical term, is interannual variability in climate. And not just any aspect of climate, but in particular we're going to focus on winter. We're going to focus on winter because it's mostly been thought, with respect to wolf and moose ecology, that it's winter that's the most important period of time. Winter is when most predation on adult moose takes place. Winter is the time that's most difficult for adult moose because there's not so much food. And winter is sometimes the condition that really can change the nature of predation. Basically, if there's not much snow on the ground, just to give one example, then it's easy for moose to get around, easy for moose to get food, and that means the moose are in pretty good shape, and that makes it tough for the wolves to catch them. If the snow is, I want to make a real specific example here, if the snow is really deep and crusty, then what happens is it's very difficult for the moose to walk around, which means it's difficult for them to get food, and then it's difficult for them to escape predation, to just run away if they are chased. But if that snow is deep and crusty, then the wolves can walk right on top of the snow. It's very easy for the wolves. And so the winter conditions can make a big deal in changing the nature of predation. But the difficulty is this, is how do you measure winter severity? Winter severity has so many different properties to it. The amount of snowfall that occurs throughout the course of the winter, you could add that up day after day after day, and the cumulative snowfall at the end of the season would be some number of inches. But snowfall is different from snow depth, because sometimes that snow will melt and then come back. So the temperature can play a role. There's also the water content of the snow. Some snow is light and fluffy and pretty easy to walk through. Some snow has a lot of water in it, and it's really heavy, and it's quite difficult to walk through. The crustiness of the snow, which is related to the water content, but not quite the same. Snow forms a crust along the top. When this happens, if it's cold, below freezing in particular, then there's no crust. But then if the temperature warms up above freezing, and then drops below freezing, then a crust forms. Well, if the snow rises above freezing and then declines for just a short period of time, and maybe just a few degrees above freezing, then the crust is not very thick, and it's also not very strong. But if the temperature warms, say 5-10 degrees Fahrenheit above freezing, and let's say it stays that way for maybe 2 complete days, 48 hours straight, and then it drops well below freezing after that, then the crust that forms will be very thick and very firm. Well, so the crustiness of the snow depends on some very, very subtle changes in temperature. And then the last aspect of winter severity will be the duration of the snow cover. Is there a lot of deep snows for just a month of the winter? Or is it spread out for maybe 3 or 4 months or something like that? All of these factors matter. Some of them we just don't even have measurements for. The water content of snow is something that in the upper Midwest is something we don't measure. Weather stations, I mean to say, tend not to measure it. So the data aren't even available even though we know that it matters. And so what people have wondered is the following. Is there some index, a single number that compiles all of these aspects of winter? And if there were such an index, is it something that we've been measuring for many, many decades? To just discover an index is one thing, a useful index, but then if you realize, oh, well, this is a great index, but many of the things in that index we haven't been measuring for all these years, it might not work. Well, here's what it turns out to be the case. Is there is an index, and it's been around for a while. We just didn't realize how useful it was until recently. This index is associated with a weather phenomenon known as the North Atlantic Oscillation, frequently abbreviated as NAO. The North Atlantic Oscillation is one of the most important weather patterns on the planet. The most important weather pattern on the planet is one that you're extremely familiar with, and it's the changes of the seasons, from spring to summer to fall to winter. That's the most important pattern in the global weather that we experience throughout the course of the year. The second most important pattern is one that you've heard of, and that is El Niño. El Niño is a weather phenomenon that involves changes in the ocean currents in the Pacific and the temperature of the Pacific Ocean in different parts of it, and it changes weather patterns throughout large portions of the world. That's the second most important weather pattern in the world. The third is the one I'm about to describe to you now, the North Atlantic Oscillation. Basically what happens is that in some years, a strong low-pressure system gets set up here in the North Atlantic, and low-pressure systems involve a circulation pattern of wind that is counterclockwise in this part of the world, in the Northern Hemisphere. And then the North Atlantic Oscillation in these particular years also involves a very strong high-pressure system just situated right here, a little bit further to the south. And those systems are associated with the clockwise pattern, those two very strong systems, they get set up in some years and then they stay there. They're very persistent week after week. And what happens is that they affect the jet stream. Basically what happens is the jet stream ends up flowing between those two systems. And that ends up having an effect, right here. That ends up having an effect on climate throughout the eastern part of North America. What happens in different years is that, and we can see this down here, is that the low pressure system in the North Atlantic ends up being fairly weak. It's not such a strong system. The weather pattern down here a little bit below remains or is also a bit weak, doesn't perform so well. And what happens is that the jet stream has this very different pattern in a situation like that. It flows in this manner here. And then what happens is it affects the weather throughout the eastern part of North America. It turns out that Lake Superior is just on that edge of influence of this North Atlantic oscillation. And it turns out that in some of these years, the North Atlantic index, well, actually, let me say one or two more things here. It's these two oscillating air pressure systems. I already described that. They affect how the jet stream is affected. And here's what happens, is that this entire phenomena can be indicated by measuring the air pressure in two places. For a long period of time, it could be measured at a spot on Iceland and at a spot at some islands off the coast of Africa. More recently, it can be measured through stations kind of throughout the Atlantic Ocean. But in any event, by just comparing the air pressure at these two places, you can get an index of this North Atlantic oscillation. And that index, that number, literally the difference in air pressure between two places in the Atlantic Ocean, becomes a useful index for winter severity in a place like Isle Royale. And so what it is that we'll end up using for climate is this NAO index. And again, there's a lot of detailed information that I'm kind of breezing over and not giving you. There's been a fair amount of work to show, work that I'm not showing you right now, work to show that ungulate populations are pretty heavily influenced by this North Atlantic oscillation, both in the eastern part of North America and also in Europe and Asia. And so anyways, the second part of this whole process is not just constructing this multiple regression equation. It's not just taking the data that we have and then constructing this equation. It's more than that. What we want to do is we want to do the second step, which is to take the R squared and partition it into its sources. And so what we basically mean by that is to ask, of all of the variability that this equation can explain, all of the variability in moose growth rate that this equation can explain, what portion of that variability is being explained because of the wolf population? What proportion of that variability is being explained because of the forage, and what is being explained because of the climate? And so what happens is we are going to end up with basically four possible hypotheses, four possible outcomes that all correspond to this decomposition of the R squared. And these hypotheses can be represented graphically. One of the hypotheses is illustrated right now, and it's the idea that wolves would explain the largest portion of that variation, and climate and forage would explain much less. The other possible hypothesis is different, and it's that forage would explain most of the variation, wolves and climate not so much. A third possibility is that climate will explain most of the variation, wolves and forage not so much. And the last possibility is maybe that they're all similarly equal. Those are the possibilities, and that's what we're going to use this regression analysis to help us figure out. And so here we have moose in the middle. And what we find out when we analyze the Isle Royale data in the way that I just described is that of all of the variation that we see in the moose growth rate, 31% of that variation can be explained by climate. Of all the variation that we see in the moose population, 23% of that variation can be explained by forage. And of all the variation that we see in the moose population, 4% of those fluctuations can be explained by fluctuations in the wolf population. And so the impression that we get is that wolves do not have a strong top-down effect on moose. Climate and forage are much more important processes. But there's a little bit more going on. If we add up these three numbers, 23%, 31%, 4%, they obviously don't add up to 100%. They don't together explain all of the variation that we see in the moose population. It turns out that 42% of all the variation that we see in the moose population goes unexplained. It's not explained by the fluctuations in the wolves or the climate or the forage. And so there become two important lessons in all of this. The first lesson is this business about wolves not having a strong top-down effect. The second important lesson is that despite 5 decades of watching, most of the variation, or not most of it, but much of the variation, the largest share of variation goes unexplained. And I want to kind of emphasize the duration here, this 5 decades. The kind of analysis that we just described, you can't even conduct it unless you have about 30 years of data or more. If you have fewer than 30 years of data, it's just not enough to get good estimates in the first place. So it takes a long time to be able to perform an analysis like this, and upon performing it, what you realize is that a big chunk of what's going on we can't explain at all. Okay. It gets a little more complicated though. After performing this analysis, which we did in about the year 2004, and it was published at that time, one of our good friends and colleagues, Chris Wilmers from University of California, Santa Cruz, he called me up and he says, John, he says, you've always been telling me that life seemed to be different after that crash of the wolf population. After the wolves crashed, you had always said that life was different. And I think that might be important in explaining what's going on with that analysis that you just published. And I said, oh yeah, you're right, Chris. Let's talk a little bit more about it. And so what we talked about is, well, first of all, how it is that life seemed different. Well, first of all, what we knew before that crash, before 1980, is that there was a certain relationship between the number of old moose on Isle Royale and the number of wolves. The number of old moose is important, more so than just the total number of moose, because it's old moose that really support the wolf population. It's old moose that are easier for wolves to kill, and so that's why the old moose are a little bit more important. And what we see here is that during years of more old moose, there tend to be more wolves. Okay, that's fine. But then after 1980, after that wolf crash, there were always fewer wolves for any given number of old moose that were on the island. This is the major way in which we thought that the life seemed to be different before and after that crash. Well, Chris was the one who kind of made the connection between this observation, which was already in the published literature, and that other regression analysis that I have been describing to you. And his idea basically was this, and so we collaborated with Chris on this idea. And he said, let's perform that very same analysis on 2 separate bits of the data. Let's do it for before the crash, the 22 years of data that we have for before that crash. And then we published this analysis in the year 2006. So there were about 25 years of data after that crash. And so let's divide it up that way, he said. And what we found is that in this case, before the wolf crash, it's wolves that explained the largest share of variation in that moose fluctuation. Climate and forage are a pretty small part of it all. And then after the wolf crash, very different story. After the wolf crash, wolves have this very, very small part in explaining the fluctuations that moose exhibit, but instead climate takes over as being the most important part of it all. And so we get 2 very different answers. Before the crash, wolves have a strong top-down influence, and after the crash, no. It's not that way. Okay. This is kind of important because you would think that if you watched a place for, say, 20 years or so, like what we have on the left-hand side, you'd think that after watching for a few decades, that if you got an answer, you'd think, that's a pretty good answer. Until you watch for another 2 or 3 decades and then get a very different answer what's on the left-hand side. And what we realize is that this answer to this question, what is the impact of wolves on moose? It's not going to be the same answer, not even for a single place, over time. Over time, the nature of that answer is going to change. Okay. Well, there's a different way of looking at the whole thing. The way that we just looked at this question is through something called time series analysis and especially making use of this notion of regression. This alternate view that I'm going to show you right now is very simple, but it's just as legitimate. And it basically goes like this. There was a wolf disease. That wolf disease represents this external influence, if you will, on the system. Because remember, again, the disease was basically brought from outside of Isle Royale into the system. That caused a major perturbation. Basically, it's like an experiment, if you will. It's an experiment in the sense that it just immediately reduced the wolf population, and then the wolf population ended up staying low for a very long period of time afterwards. Okay? Well, after the wolf disease, what we see is that the moose population increased. And after the moose population increased, there was a long period, and I'm not showing you the data in detail, but there's a long period where balsam fir population, or where the growth in balsam fir declined for many, many years in a row in response to that large number of moose. That paper, or that idea, was published in a paper in 1994 by Brian McLaren and Rolf Peterson. It was published in Science because it was one of the very first demonstrations of what we know today and what was known at that time as a trophic cascade. It's one of the first demonstrations of a trophic cascade in a terrestrial system. And it suggests, by looking at the whole time series, that wolves have a strong top-down effect on moose. And so here we have this one question: do wolves have a strong top-down effect or not? And we're getting a variety of answers. One of the answers that we get by looking at this rather simple but pretty useful explanation of just, one thing happened and then another after that and something followed after that, is that yes, there's a strong trophic cascade that occurs on Isle Royale. But then if we look at this other situation here, what happens for the last basically 25, 30 years on Isle Royale after that crash, we find no, wolves don't have a strong effect on moose at all. We're getting different answers. In this case, I think the different answers are not so much because the system has changed. It used to be one thing, and now it's another thing. I think the reason that we're getting a different answer here is because the analysis is different, and the analysis is pointing out to different aspects of population dynamics. When a population fluctuates, there are always two aspects of that fluctuation. One aspect of that fluctuation would be little small changes from one year to the next in abundance. Little tiny fluctuations. The variance, if you will. The variance in abundance. The other aspect of fluctuations in any population would be the average long-term trend. And so you can think of a population as changing in this very slow manner. Just long, slow trends, maybe increasing or decreasing. And then superimposed on top of that are the short-term fluctuations, up and down around those slower shifts. What's happening is this analysis on the left-hand side is really focusing on those longer-term trends, those slower shifts and dynamics. And the analysis on the right-hand side, the one that focuses on regression analysis, is really focusing on the short-term fluctuations. It's different aspects of the population. So when we have this question, do wolves have a strong top-down effect or not? You have to say, well, a strong top-down effect on what part of a population's fluctuations? Depending on the aspect of the population fluctuations that you're interested in, you might get different answers. And on Isle Royale, we see that that's the case. Okay. Well, if you didn't think that that wasn't complicated enough, it gets more complicated. So imagine this. It's the same question, do wolves have a strong top-down effect or not? Imagine a graph, and for this graph, on the x-axis, what we have is the biomass or abundance of elk on the landscape. And then on the y-axis, we have the abundance of wolves on the landscape. Well, if the answer to the question is yes, if wolves have a strong top-down effect, then you'd expect this kind of downward trend. And let me run through what I mean by that. Basically, if you have an awful lot of wolves on the landscape, and if they have a strong effect, well, then you'd expect, well, maybe not so many ungulates, and you'd be right here on this graph. If, however, for whatever reason, you have not excuse me for that line. If we have not so many wolves on the landscape, I mean to be right over here, if we have not so many wolves on the landscape, that would release predation pressure on the ungulates. That would allow for there to be many more ungulates, like over here on the right-hand side, and we'd be right here on the graph. And that's why you'd expect that if wolves have a strong top-down influence, then the graph would look something like this. Okay, well, this is what the data look like when you ask the following question, where what you do is where the data points represent, each one of these little data points represents a different place across North America where the population of wolves and moose were observed for a few years, and the average number of wolves, the average number of moose were calculated, and then the dot was placed on the graph according to that. Now, the size of these dots basically refer to how long the system was watched. And the basic idea is the longer you watch the system, it's probably a more reliable indication of what's going on. So a place that's been watched for a long time gets a bigger dot. To give you a little sense of things, to put some names on just a couple of places here, Isle Royale is right here in this situation where you have a relatively large number of ungulates, relatively large number of wolves, and then Yellowstone is an example of an even more extreme case right here. Okay, so the answer seems to be no. Wolves don't have a strong top-down effect when you look at the data in this way. Well, let's look at the data in a similar sort of way, but instead of looking at variation over space, variation over North America, variation in the abundance of wolves and moose at different places across North America like we did on the left, let's instead look at variation over time in a single place. It'll be the same graph, though, in terms of the ungulate biomass. The x and y axis are just the same. And it's still the same case. If the answer is yes, that wolves have a strong top-down effect, then we'll expect this declining trend, and we'll expect it for the same reason. And then when we fill this graph out with data from Isle Royale, where each data point represents a different year on Isle Royale, then what we find is that there's a negative trend, suggesting that the answer is yes. And so what happens, again, is that we have this one question, do wolves have a strong top-down effect or not? And we're getting now different answers. And now I think the reason that we're getting different answers is because we're analyzing the question in different ways. In one case, we're looking at variation in space. In the other case, we're looking at variation over time. And I think it's basically, we're asking actually different questions, and that's why we're getting different answers. There's even another way to look at the data. On the left-hand graph, we have the very same data that we have been looking at. On the right-hand side, it's the same business of where each one of these data points represents a different location across North America. But instead, the axes are quite different. In this case, the y, or vertical axis, is showing the density of ungulates at these different places across North America. And then across the x-axis, what we have is not the abundance of predators, not how many wolves are there, but instead the diversity of predators. Are there just no predators, or maybe one species of predator? Are there two predators or more than two? Well, what predators are we talking about? We're talking basically about wolves, grizzly bears, black bears, and humans. And it's basically how many of these species are there, and in some cases mountain lions as well. How many of these species are there? And what we see is that when there are few predator species, there tend to be a lot of ungulates. But as you increase the number of predator species, then there tends to be a decrease in the number of ungulates. And there's something about the diversity of predators that makes a difference. Well, how can this be? Here's how, is that each of these predators basically has a different strategy. Let me just pick one example, grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are asleep for half the year. So prey are safe from grizzly bears because they're asleep for half the year. Let me give another example. Human predators who are included in this graph, or humans as predators, they're included in this graph. Humans mostly concentrate their hunting efforts at just a very specific time of the year, either the fall or sometimes the midwinter. And depending on the part of the world that we're talking in, where the hunt is taking place, sometimes the hunts are really specific. It might be only on the bulls. In some cases it's not, but some cases it is. The point is that these different types of predators have different strategies. And so those different strategies mean they're hitting the predator in different ways, and that's probably what's going on here. And so the point is that if you have this question, do wolves have a strong top-down effect? The answer is no when we look at that left graph, or seems to be no, but the answer is yes when we look at this graph on the right-hand side. And so now, as we're wrapping up with this particular lecture, we have this one question, but we're getting these different answers. And in a nutshell, the reason that we're getting these different answers is because not all predation systems are the same. Isle Royale is going to maybe be different than Yellowstone. Yellowstone is maybe going to be different than how the situation is in Sweden, where there are wolves and moose. Maybe different than in different locations throughout Canada and Alaska. Even though it may be the same predator, wolves, throughout, the effect of predation can be different at each one of those systems. Any particular system, like even just Isle Royale, can change over time, and that will give us the appearance of different answers. And then the last reason that we seem to get different answers is because the question itself is very imprecise. And I already went through in the last several slides how that question can really mean several different kinds of questions by referring not only to predator abundance but also to predator diversity, and not by referring to variation over time but also variation over space, and so on. And so answers that appear to conflict may only appear so because they're actually answering different questions. And so the big lesson for all of this from a scientific perspective is, oh my goodness, what a complicated planet we live on, and it's really just kind of a complexity to kind of relish in and appreciate, and just to kind of, as scientists, dive in and try to understand it the best we can. The question also has some very important implications for predator control, has very important implications for how should we manage wolves and ungulates across the landscape. I'm going to leave the implications of these results for predator control for another lecture, but just make note of it is quite important, and we'll capture that in just a short bit of time. For now, what I want to do is just point out again, just to recap, there are three basic methods of analysis for this wolf and moose time series. The historical narrative is the broadest way that we can go through this. We already spoke about that a couple lectures ago. The statistical time series analysis that we just described is another way to go through this time series. We just have done that, and the lessons we get here are a bit different from the lessons we got from the historical narrative. The lessons just enrich the story that we're telling and the lessons that we're learning. It's not really a conflict between the different lessons, just kind of seeing it from different perspectives. And then what we're going to do during the next lecture is we're going to shift gears and focus on kind of the mechanics of predation. And in doing so, we're going to learn different lessons yet again. And so that concludes this lecture. And so again, as always, thanks for your attention, and look forward to sharing with you more information during the next lecture.